Hello and welcome to It's Not Well in China. I'm Robin Chang.
And I'm Noah Liu.
We're here to bring you a special episode, a comprehensive examination of one of Japan's most shocking family murders. We'll take you through every detail of this tragic case, from its earliest beginnings to its lasting impact on Japanese society. Let's begin on a cold night in January 2003, in Fukuoka City, Japan. A hamburger shop on the outskirts of town is about to become the scene of a crime that would set in motion a chain of events, leading to unimaginable tragedy.
By morning, the owner would discover their safe had been ransacked, with 2.3 million missing. That's approximately $30,000 in today's money, Robin.
But what's particularly interesting about this robbery, Noah, is that it wasn't just a random break-in, was it?
No, one of the thieves knew exactly what he was doing. Yang Ning had worked at that very shop just 3 months earlier. He knew every blind spot in the security system, every corner of that establishment.
And he wasn't working alone.
No, outside stood his lookout, Wang Liang. Both young men were from Changchun, a city in northeastern China. And this is where our story takes its first fascinating turn, because these weren't your typical criminals.
Far from it. Tell us about their backgrounds, Noah.
Yang Ning's father held a prestigious position as an office director at the China-Japan Friendship Association in Changchun. It was this connection that had actually helped pave the way for his son to study in Japan in 2001. Wang Liang came from even more privileged circumstances. His parents owned a successful construction company back in China.
So, these were young men from good families, with every advantage. How did they end up here?
It's a classic tale of gradual descent, Robin. Yang Ning had initially done well. He'd graduated from language school and entered a private university in Kitakyushu by April 2002. Wang Liang followed, moving in with Yang that November. But Fukuoka proved to be their undoing.
Paint us a picture of Fukuoka, Noah.
It's a fascinating city, a port town where ancient temples stand alongside modern shopping centers. But it's the Nakasu district that caught our protagonists in its web, a place where neon lights paint the night sky in a kaleidoscope of colors. It was in this seductive atmosphere that both young men began to lose their way.
And their parents had no idea.
None whatsoever. They continued sending monthly allowances, believing their sons were diligently studying. But when these funds couldn't sustain their growing appetite for Fukuoka's nightlife, Yang and Wang turned to petty theft targeting school shops and convenience stores. The hamburger shop heist was their biggest score yet.
And then enters our third character, Weiwei. Tell us about him.
Weiwei presents a fascinating contrast to our other two protagonists. Unlike their privileged backgrounds, he came from a modest merchant family in Xiaimi City, Henan Province. But his early life had shown such promise. He'd been an exemplary student, class president, even a provincial martial arts champion.
Yet something went wrong.
Indeed, in 1998, he'd entered the Japanese language department at Liaoning University of Foreign Studies, but was mysteriously expelled. By April 2001, he was in Fukuoka, dreaming of entering either Kyushu University or Fukuoka University. But his Japanese wasn't good enough, and he had to settle for a basic computer school.
And this is where our three paths converge.
In the most unlikely of places, an internet cafe. For Weiwei, who had become completely isolated in Japan, this chance meeting with Yang and Wang seemed like a gift. Three lonely, frustrated young men, each carrying their own sense of failure, found solace in each other's company.
But their friendship would prove deadly, wouldn't it?
By June 2003, they were all desperate. Wang couldn't re-enroll in school. Yang had disappeared from university, claiming he needed money from China, and Weiwei's father's factory was struggling to pay his tuition. Then came that fateful idea. The Japanese are making all the money. We need to take it back.
And on June 18, the security cameras captured one of them, making what would prove to be a crucial purchase.
4 pairs of handcuffs, and 2 dumbbells. At the time, it seemed meaningless, but these items would soon be used in one of Japan's most horrific family murders.
3 young men, barely 22 years old, were about to commit a crime that would send shockwaves through Japan. The Matsumoto family, going about their daily lives, had no idea they were being watched. No idea that fate was about to turn so tragically against them.
And that, Robin. Shall we move on to the night that changed everything? The long summer days of June in Fukuoka can seem endless, but as evening fell on June 19th, 2003, shadows were already stretching across the streets of the Higashi ward.
The Matsumoto family had just finished a shopping trip, hadn't they?
Yes, and this is where we need to pause and understand the timeline of what would become their final hours. At around 6 p.m., Chika Matsumoto took their 2 children, 11-year-old Kai and 8-year-old Hina, to visit her father's house. Her husband, Shinjiro, stayed behind, saying he had other matters to attend to.
His last words to his family were remarkably ordinary, weren't they?
Yes, just a casual "I'll be home later." No one could have known these would be the last words he'd ever speak to his family.
By 8:30 that evening, Chika had returned home with the children. Shinjiro wasn't there, but that wasn't necessarily unusual, was it?
No, but what was unusual was the presence of 3 young men watching the house from the shadows. They'd been studying the family's routine for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Take us through what happened next, Noah.
As midnight approached, most homes in the neighborhood gone dark, but one light remained on the bathroom light in the Matsumoto home. Chika was taking a bath, completely unaware of what was about to unfold.
And our 3 perpetrators made their move.
Just after midnight, they scaled the low wall of the yard. They found their entry point, an unlocked ground floor window. Wei Wei and Yang Ning grabbed hats hanging by the doorway to disguise themselves and headed for the bathroom. Wang Liang positioned himself upstairs, outside the children's room.
What happened next is particularly disturbing, Noah. Listeners might want to be prepared.
The silence was shattered by Chika's scream as the bathroom door burst open. Wei Wei and Yang attacked immediately, forcing her underwater until she lost consciousness. Their initial search of the house yielded only $15,000, about $100, and a few bank cards.
But they weren't finished, were they?
No, they revived Chika to get the PIN numbers for the bank cards. What followed was truly horrific. They tortured her, subjected her to sexual assault, and repeatedly cut into her flesh. The forensic report would later show more than 30 knife wounds across her body.
By 12:30 a.m., Wei Wei and Yang joined Wang upstairs. The children were still asleep, weren't they?
Yes, moonlight was streaming through the window, illuminating the peaceful faces of Kai and Hina. The 3 men made their terrible decision: no witnesses could be left alive.
The method of killing the children. It's particularly heartbreaking.
Wei Wei went downstairs to fetch some of Shinjiro's neckties. He used one to strangle Kai, who never woke up. 8-year-old Hina was handcuffed and taken downstairs to await her father's return.
At 1:20 a.m., Shinjiro's Mercedes pulled into the driveway.
He saw the lights on, but thought nothing of it. As he stepped inside, Wei Wei struck him from behind with a wooden club. They handcuffed him and took $23,000 from his wallet, about $150.
Then came perhaps the most horrific moment of all.
They dragged Shinjiro to the bathroom and splashed him with cold water. When he opened his eyes, he saw his wife's bloodied body in the tub. He fell to his knees, begging them to spare his children. When they demanded his bank card pins, he told them the truth: he was deep in debt. There was nothing in his accounts.
They didn't believe him.
No, Wei Wei began beating Shinjiro savagely. During the struggle, Shinjiro was thrown against the glass shower door, shattering it. They used a vacuum cleaner cord to bind him tighter. By 2 a.m., Wei Wei and Yang had strangled both Shinjiro and young Hina.
Then came the disposal of the bodies.
They handcuffed the bodies in pairs, weighing them down with the dumbbells and an iron block they'd prepared. Wei drove the Mercedes to Hakata Bay, 3 kilometers away. He had to make 2 trips to dispose of all 4 bodies.
And the cleanup?
They drove the Mercedes to a parking lot in Kurum City, located in southern Fukuoka Prefecture, about 40 kilometers from the Matsumoto residence, where they meticulously cleaned it. They disposed of all incriminating evidence, including blood-stained bathmates, cords, and ties. The total amount they gained from this brutal crime: a mere $38,000, approximately $260. Wei took $10,000, while Wang and Yang each received $14,000.
They abandoned the Mercedes and took a train back to Fukuoka City.
Yes, and as dawn broke over Hakata Bay, no one could have guessed what lay beneath those calm waters. The killers themselves couldn't have imagined the far-reaching consequences of their night of violence.
Perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Neighbors later recalled hearing noises that night, a raised voice, a muffled shout. But they assumed it was just a domestic argument. No one called for help. No one checked.
A simple oversight that would have catastrophic consequences. In that peaceful neighborhood, a family's existence was erased in the span of a single, savage night.
Next, we'll look at who the Matsumoto family really was, and the hidden struggles they faced in the months leading up to that fatal night.
To understand the full tragedy of what happened to the Matsumoto family, we need to step back and look at who they were before that terrible night.
Their story centers around a bustling shopping street in Fukuoka's Higashi ward, doesn't it?
Yes, just a stone's throw from the Kyushu University Medical School. Every morning, as dawn broke, that street would come alive with activity. And there was one sight the local shopkeepers had grown particularly fond of: an energetic 11-year-old boy named Kai Matsumoto, always wearing neat shorts, playing football with his friends.
The baker on that street had a particular fondness for him, didn't he?
Yes, he would often say to his customers, "There goes Kai-kun, playing again." It wasn't just Kai, the whole family was well known. Shinjiro, the soft-spoken father, Chika, the impeccably dressed mother, they were the epitome of what the Japanese would consider a model family.
But as with many perfect facades, there were cracks beneath the surface. Let's go back to the beginning of their story.
It starts in 1983, when 21-year-old Shinjiro Matsumoto was working at a Korean restaurant in Tokyo. That's where he fell in love with Korean cuisine and learned the ins and outs of restaurant management.
And he was quite entrepreneurial, wasn't he?
Indeed. By 1988, at just 26 years old, he opened his own Korean restaurant in Fukuoka's Central District. He called it the Zoo. Then, in 1990, he met Chika, and their love story began.
Tell us about their early family life.
After marriage, they settled in Fukuoka's Higashi ward, buying that house on the shopping street we mentioned. Their first child, Kai, was born in 1992, and 3 years later, they welcomed Hina.
By all accounts, Hina was quite special.
As cute as a doll, and such a polite girl, that's how one of her classmates' mothers described her. At Fukuoka Futaba Elementary School, 8-year-old Hina was a model student. Every morning, she'd wait outside for her grandfather to take her to school, while Kai, who attended the affiliated elementary school of Fukuoka Kaisi Girls Academy, would be driven by his mother.
But there was a darker history to the family, wasn't there?
Yes, and this is where things get interesting. Fukuoka had once been a hotbed of gang activity. Shinjiro's father and uncle had actually been involved with the Yakuza, working in adult entertainment and gambling operations.
And when did things start to go wrong for Shinjiro himself?
After his father passed away shortly after Hina's birth, Shinjiro inherited some money and a house. He used this to open a second Korean restaurant. In April 2001, he even appeared in the media at the Tenjin Koreatown event, selling Korean ribs. He seemed to be at the peak of his success.
But then came September 2001.
Yes, the mad cow disease crisis. When a cow in Chiba Prefecture tested positive, it devastated Japan's restaurant industry. People were terrified of contaminated meat, and barbecue restaurants were particularly hard hit. By January 2002, both of Shinjiro's restaurants had gone under.
And this is where his desperate decisions begin.
He mortgaged the family home for a 40 million bank loan that's about $266,000. Then he borrowed another 7 million from friends and gave it to a relative to invest. But the relative squandered it all, leaving only an empty apology, "I can't repay you."
The spiral continued, didn't it?
Mid-2002, he partnered with Chica's brother-in-law to open a fabric store. That failed too, but not before he borrowed another 10 million from him. By 2003, the brother-in-law had pulled out of the partnership.
And then Shinjiro made some truly desperate choices.
He turned to loan sharks. He even rented an apartment 4 kilometers away to grow poppies, hoping to make money in the drug trade. But without any real criminal connections, he couldn't even pay the interest on his loans.
Yet through all this, they maintained appearances, didn't they?
Remarkably so. To their neighbors, Shinjiro was still the well-dressed gentleman who spoke softly. Chika maintained her elegant appearance, never letting on about their financial troubles. Every day, she'd drive the children to school, everything looking perfectly normal on the surface.
Their last day together, June 19, 2003, was so ordinary.
Just a family shopping trip at 6 p.m. When Chika took the children to visit her father, no one could have imagined it would be their final outing together. When she returned home at 8:30 p.m. to find Shinjiro still absent, perhaps she felt a twinge of worry, but nothing could have prepared her for what was coming.
The next morning, the baker opened his shop as usual, expecting to see Kai playing football. But that sight would never come again.
When the 4 bodies were pulled from Hakata Bay, the residents of that shopping street realized that the perfect family they thought they knew had been hiding invisible cracks all along.
Years later, people still speak of them, don't they?
Yes, the boy who played football, the doll-like girl, the gentle father, and the graceful mother. Their story remains an open wound on that street, a reminder that beneath the quiet surface of any life, battles and fractures may lie unseen.
We'll examine how the police unraveled this complex case and the crucial mistakes that led them to the killers.
The morning of June 23, 2003, began with a worried grandfather standing at his daughter's doorstep. It was 8:30 a.m. and something was wrong.
This was his regular routine, wasn't it?
Yes, every morning he would pick up his 8-year-old granddaughter Hina for school. But that morning, 2 things immediately struck him as odd. The dark Mercedes was missing from the driveway, and Hina, who would normally be waiting eagerly at the door, was nowhere to be seen.
And his calls went unanswered.
"My granddaughter needs to get to school. I've been waiting out here for a while." His words echoed through the crisp morning air, met only by silence.
He then made some crucial phone calls, didn't he?
By 8:45 a.m., he'd called both schools. Neither Hina nor her brother Kai had arrived. When he contacted the police, and they suggested the family might have taken an impromptu trip, his response was absolutely resolute.
What did he say?
"Impossible. My daughter was at home last night, and there was no mention of any travel plans."
And while the police were beginning to investigate this missing persons case, something horrific was being discovered at Hakata Bay.
Yes, at 2:25 p.m. a dock worker at Sashinokuma Pier made a chilly human leg floating in the water. When police and firefighters arrived, they found not 1 body, but 4 bound together with handcuffs.
The forensic evidence was particularly disturbing, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The initial evidence collected included 4 waterlogged handcuffs, ropes, 2 dumbbells, and a rusty iron block. The autopsy findings were heartbreaking. While the children had been killed before being thrown into the water, the parents had been alive when submerged, drowning slowly in the frigid sea.
And Chika's body told its own horrible story.
Yes, over 30 knife wounds, and traces of skin under her fingernails, evidence of her desperate final struggle.
Take us through the crime scene at the house.
The police found the front door locked and intact, but the entryway showed clear signs of a struggle. The bedrooms had been ransacked, and they found unfamiliar footprints on one of the floors. But it was the bathroom that held the most disturbing clues.
What did they find there?
Shattered glass, but curiously, no glass shards on the floor, a missing vacuum cleaner, and blood spatter on both the bathtub and walls. The scene suggested at least 3 perpetrators.
The investigation began with the obvious suspects, didn't it?
Yes, they first looked at the family's social connections: Chica's father, the relative who had squandered their investment, the brother-in-law who'd withdrawn from their business venture. But all had solid alibis.
Then they considered the Yakuza angle.
Given the brutality of the crime, especially the flesh cutting, it seemed possible. But while Shinjiro's father and uncle had Yakuza connections, Shinjiro himself had no ties to organized crime.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected detail, didn't it?
Yes, investigators noticed that the handcuffs and dumbbells used in the crime were commercially available items. They began reviewing surveillance footage from nearby shops that sold such items, and there it was, June 18th, 2 days before the murder, a young Asian man buying 4 sets of handcuffs and 2 dumbbells.
This led to the first significant lead.
On July 22, 2003, police released a composite sketch of the suspect. Among hundreds of tips, one stood out: the man might be a language school student named Wang Liang.
The investigation accelerated from there, didn't it?
Rapidly. On August 3, police searched Wang's apartment. While he was gone, they found crucial evidence clothes matching those in the surveillance footage, and the landlord reported a missing iron doorstop that matched the weight and dimensions of the iron block found with the bodies.
Then came the arrest of Wei Wei.
Yes, on August 6th, though initially for an unrelated assault. He was caught trying to flee to China with borrowed money, $110,000, about $730.
But there was another fascinating twist still to come.
A week later, witnesses reported seeing an Audi near the Matsumoto home in the early hours of June 20th. But this Audi car was later proven to be unrelated to the case. A taxi driver confirmed seeing the Mercedes, with someone matching Wang's description in the passenger seat.
The forensic evidence sealed the case, didn't it?
Indeed, though the Mercedes had been meticulously cleaned, forensic teams found DNA that matched samples from Wang's apartment. But perhaps the most dramatic break came from an unexpected source.
Tell us about the garage owner in Liaoyang City, China.
On August 19th, in the Beta district of Liaoyang City, a garage owner reported unusual behavior from a new employee who introduced himself as Chang Yonggang. This young man had been spending lavishly, making purchases that far exceeded his salary, including acquiring an expensive motorcycle. The garage owner grew increasingly suspicious and believed the employee might be involved in theft.
And when police arrived,
He tried to flee, but was quickly caught. During interrogation, he confessed to being Wang Liang. Days later, on August 28, Beijing police captured Yang Ning.
a remarkable piece of international police work.
Yes, through the combination of everyday surveillance footage, a simple doorstop, and cooperation between 2 nations, one of Japan's most shocking mass murders was solved.
But for the investigators, the case left some haunting memories, didn't it?
Yes, not the triumph of solving it, but the image of those 4 bodies floating in the sea, and the elderly man who stood at his daughter's door that morning, waiting for a granddaughter who would never emerge.
We'll examine how justice was served across 2 different legal systems, and the long path to the final verdict.
In the interrogation room of the Fukuoka Prefectural Police, 23-year-old Weiwei fell to his knees, sobbing. His words would prove prophetic. If my death can bring even a shred of solace to the victims' families, then I hope for the death penalty.
But before justice could be served, there was a significant legal hurdle to overcome, wasn't there?
Yes, And this is where the case becomes particularly interesting from a legal standpoint. By August 2003, all three suspects were in custody, but there was no extradition treaty between China and Japan.
Which created quite a complex situation.
Indeed, Wang Liang and Yang Ming were detained in China and couldn't be sent to Japan for trial. This meant the case would have to be tried under two different legal systems.
The Fukuoka police took an unusual approach, didn't they?
Yes, they worked through Interpol to request cooperation from Chinese authorities. A team of Japanese officers and prosecutors actually flew to China. But this is where cultural and legal differences began to emerge.
Tell us about those differences.
In Japan, suspects must be informed of their right to remain silent. It's a fundamental protection against self-incrimination. But in China, this wasn't standard procedure.
And this created problems with the evidence, didn't it?
Exactly. When Wang and Yang were interrogated without being informed of their right to silence, Japan's Ministry of Justice questioned whether their confessions could be considered valid evidence. They were particularly concerned about the suspects being handcuffed to chairs during lengthy interrogations.
But ultimately, the nature of the crime influenced the judicial decision.
Yes, given the brutal murder of 4 innocent people, including 2 children, the court decided to accept the confessions as valid evidence.
Take us through the trials.
On October 19, 2004, the Liaoyang Intermediate People's Court began proceedings. The prosecution laid out every horrific detail: the robbery plan, the sexual assault, the murders, the disposal of the bodies.
And the verdicts came in January 2005.
Yes, Yang Ning received the death penalty, while Wang Liang, who had turned himself in and helped capture Yang, got life imprisonment. Their appeals were particularly shocking, weren't they?
What did they claim?
They first argued about unclear roles in the crime, but then made an absolutely astonishing claim that their actions were somehow justified by Japan's historical invasion of northeastern China. The court, of course, dismissed these arguments entirely.
And what of Weiwei's trial in Japan?
On May 19, 2005, the Fukuoka High Court sentenced him to death for rape, murder, and corpse abandonment. But perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment came during his 2007 appeal.
His father attended that hearing, didn't he?
Yes, he traveled from China to testify. When Weiwei saw his father, he broke down in tears. But his father never once looked at him, only addressing the court to say, "I will never forgive him."
Weiwei made one final appeal in 2010.
He claimed he was merely an accomplice who had been coerced into participating. But on October 23, 2011, Japan's Supreme Court upheld the death sentence, citing his crucial role in the crimes.
It would be another 8 years before the sentence was carried out.
Yes, on December 26, 2019, 16 years after the crimes, 39-year-old Weiwei faced execution at the Fukuoka Detention Center. It was the first execution order signed by newly appointed Justice Minister Masako Mori.
The Japanese method of execution is quite specific, isn't it?
Yes, it's a long drop hanging. The prisoner is handcuffed, blindfolded, and fitted with a noose. 3 executioners simultaneously press buttons, but only one actually triggers the mechanism, a system designed to prevent any individual from knowing they were responsible for the death.
Weiwei's final communication was particularly poignant.
Before his execution, he wrote a single Chinese character, Hui, meaning regret, and sent it to his parents in China. Whether this represented genuine remorse or simple resignation, we'll never know.
And what about the victim's family?
When journalists informed Chika's father about Weiwei's execution, his response was heartbreaking. Though many years have passed, as a surviving relative, there is nothing but grief.
Over those 16 years, both countries' legal systems were tested.
Yes, and while justice was technically served, no verdict could truly compensate for the loss of an entire family. And for the families of the 3 young men, they had to live with the knowledge that their sons were murderers.
The case raised some profound questions about justice across borders, didn't it?
Indeed, it wasn't just about balancing crime and punishment, but about reconciling two different legal traditions and addressing fundamental questions about crime and humanity.
We'll examine the lasting impact this case had on both Japanese society and the Chinese community in Japan.
On a winter morning in 2019, the commercial street in Fukuoka's Higashi ward looked much as it always had. The baker still opened his shop early. The neighboring store's lights still flickered on one by one.
But something was missing, wasn't it?
Yes, the boy in shorts who used to play football, the little girl who would run out her front door like a living doll, their absence was still felt, even 16 years later.
When Justice Minister Masako Mori announced Wei Wei's execution on television, it brought everything flooding back for the local residents, didn't it?
They all remembered that summer morning in 2003 when news of the Matsumoto family's fate first swept through their community. But the impact of this case extended far beyond that single street.
The Chinese student community in Japan felt the effects immediately, didn't they?
Devastatingly so. Anti-Chinese sentiment bubbled up online, and the Japanese embassy in China tightened its visa policies, particularly for students from Changchun. Many applications were simply rejected outright.
We actually have a quote from a Chinese student who was in Fukuoka at the time.
Yes, and it's quite telling. That time was incredibly tough. Scholarship applications were denied, and even getting a library card involved additional scrutiny. Some Japanese classmates started avoiding us, and finding work at convenience stores became difficult.
The impact spread to the business world as well.
Japanese companies became hesitant to hire Chinese graduates. Even Japanese host families, who had previously welcomed Chinese students warmly, began declining new applications. A criminal act by 3 individuals cast a shadow over an entire community.
The cultural exchange between the two countries suffered too, didn't it?
We spoke to a Chinese restaurateur who had been in business for over 20 years. He told us business dropped off sharply. Regular Japanese customers stopped coming, and while they never said anything, we all understood why. Even activities planned by Japan-China friendship associations were postponed or canceled.
But there were some positive changes that came from this tragedy.
Yes, particularly in law enforcement cooperation. By 2004, Japan and China had established stronger mechanisms for preventing and combating cross-border crime. They began holding regular meetings, sharing intelligence, and collaborating on issues like student crime and fraud.
The education sector responded as well.
Language schools in Japan enhanced their oversight of foreign students and began offering mental health counseling. Special offices were set up to help students navigate both academic and personal challenges. The Chinese consulates also became more proactive, organizing regular meetings to promote legal education and safety awareness.
The case also reignited debates about capital punishment in Japan, didn't it?
Indeed, Japan remains one of the few developed nations that still maintains the death penalty. A 2014 government survey showed 80% of respondents supported it, and the Wei case became a focal point in these discussions.
What were the arguments on both sides?
Supporters argued that crimes like the Matsumoto murders warranted the ultimate penalty to bring closure to victims' families. Opponents countered that execution neither brings back the dead nor eases the pain of loss, and worried about irreparable judicial mistakes.
Tell us about the memorial aspects of this case.
A nearby temple still holds services for the Matsumoto family. On the anniversary of their deaths, residents come to lay flowers. The temple priest told us, "We cannot bring back the lives that were lost, but we can remember and learn from this, valuing peace in the present."
And there's been a particularly touching development at the crime scene itself, hasn't there?
Yes, in 2023, journalists discovered that the Matsumoto home had been transformed into a bookstore. The owner, an elderly Japanese man who preferred to remain anonymous, created a small memorial space with a faded family photograph, Shinjiro smiling warmly. Chica appearing elegant, their children beaming with innocence.
What did he say about his decision to create this space?
His words were quite moving. We mustn't forget this tragedy, but more importantly, we need to remember that every life is unique and precious. I opened this bookstore to use the power of knowledge and culture to remind people of life's value.
16 years have passed since that terrible night. The waters of Hakata Bay still lap gently at the shore. The three young men have paid for their crimes, and a once happy family exists now only in memory.
But the case continues to raise important questions about education, justice, cultural exchange, and human nature itself.
You've been listening to It's Not Well in China. I'm Robin Chang.
And I'm Noah Liu. If you enjoy our show, please subscribe to It's Not Well in China podcast to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. Don't forget to leave us a review and share it with your friends to help us continue bringing you more captivating stories and in-depth analysis.
Thank you again for your company. See you in the next episode.